friend, Dr. Frances Widdowson, visiting all the way from Calgary, Alberta. Dr. Frances Widdowson is an expert in Indigenous policy and has studied issues pertaining to truth and reconciliation for 30 years. She first worked as a policy analyst for the government of the Northwest Territories, combining science and Indigenous knowledge. She then received a PhD in political science at York University and worked as a professor for 15 years studying Indigenous policy. She has 2 peer-reviewed books on Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations and edited a volume that incorporated diverse perspectives on Indigenous ways of knowing into the university curriculum. For the last 8 years, she has worked with a network of researchers studying the history of the residential schools. She is currently a senior fellow with the Frontier Centre for Public Policy. Frances is one of the authors of Canada's current bestseller book, Grave Error, about the Kamloops Indian residential schools. And at this time, I would like to bring Frances Widdowson up here to speak on this subject. Thank you.
Don't touch it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, councillors, for allowing me to speak with you today. My name is Frances Widdowson. I live in Calgary, Alberta. In 19...
Sorry, Frances. Could I ask people in the audience to please not speak when it's not your turn? We need to listen to the person who's speaking. I would like you to stop talking too, please. Thank you. Carry on.
Can we have the clock, the time added to the clock, please?
No, we may not. Carry on.
Excuse me? So you're not going to add time to the clock even though you took time speaking?
No.
Is that correct?
That's correct. Thank you.
So once again, we see what is wrong with the council in Powell River. In 1935, black scholar W.E.B. Du Bois, a famous black scholar, wrote an essay about the Black Reconstruction, which was the period after slavery in the United States. The essay made the following insightful observation about writing history. Quote, "What is the object of writing the history of Reconstruction? Is it to wipe out the disgrace of a people which ought to make slaves of Negroes? Is it to show that the North had higher motives than freeing black men? Is it to prove that the Negroes were black angels? No, it is simply to establish the truth on which right in the future may be built." Unquote. This quote is important for today's delegation because it draws attention to issues that have been on the minds of citizens of Powell River for the last 3 years. Truth and reconciliation, or as Du Bois would put it, establish the truth on which right may be built, and right is justice, on which justice may be built. In these discussions, it is claimed again and again that we need truth before we can achieve reconciliation. This was the position of Sean Carlton, an academic from the University of Manitoba who gave the lecture on, quote, "Who was Israel Wood Powell?" at the Powell River Library in February. Carlton, however, made a number of untrue claims in his presentation, as well as in the past. Most disturbing was his position a few years ago that a mass grave of 215 children's bodies had been found at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. My work on this case in the book Grave Error is based on the research of the incredible researcher Nina Green, has shown that this is false, and how it is in fact highly improbable that even one child is buried in the Kamloops apple orchard. The assertion that we must have truth before we will achieve reconciliation was also the position of the Joint Working Group. It claimed, for example, that the Tla'amin Nation was proposing the name change in light of the increasing social awareness of the truths of colonialism and the harmful legacy of the actions of Israel Powell that he has had and continues to have on the Tla'amin people. This statement about social awareness about these truths assumes that we as a society are trying to work towards a common understanding. This makes sense because it is only through agreement about the causes of problems that we can work out how to solve them. If it is true that Israel Powell's actions created a harmful legacy, we would all need to understand that what this consisted of before we could address it. Over the last 3 years, however, residents of Powell River have been discouraged from trying to develop this common understanding. Those who try to correct misinformation are shouted down and told that they are racist and white supremacists. This is what happened to a number of Powell River residents on June 1st, 2022 at the open mic session put on by the Joint Working Group. For the Joint Working Group, however, the truth already has been found, and its job is to educate residents until they accept it. But this is not how we develop a common understanding. The pursuit of truth, to try to develop the most accurate understanding of reality, that is, must be based upon reason, evidence, and logic. This can occur only when one has the ability to hear about all the information that is available and make up one's own mind about its validity. The Joint Working Group has been able to assert its highly contentious views as truth by referring to concepts like epistemic racism. Although most people understand racism to be believing that a group is inferior because of its biological characteristics and arguing that it should be deprived of rights on this basis, epistemic racism is defined by the BC government as, quote, the positioning of knowledge of one racialized group as superior to another, including the judgment of not only which knowledge is considered valuable, but is considered to be knowledge. Would the Joint Working Group oppose the questioning of an Indigenous knowledge keeper's claims about hundreds of children's bodies being found at Kamloops on the grounds that this constitutes epistemic racism? To state that racism is epistemic, in fact, is to label the challenging of any Indigenous idea as racist. This is a major problem facing the people of Powell River and any possible attempts to get at the truth. Although it is bad enough that false information goes unchallenged because of intimidation, this tactic has even more serious consequences. It encourages Indigenous people to see any disagreement as evidence of hatred, harm, discrimination, and this is false. It is a direct assault on the development of truth needed to achieve reconciliation. Indigenous people need honesty, not condescension and patronization. And many of the things that are happening with respect to discussions of Indigenous people right now, including the use of the Indigenous phonetic alphabet, which is not spoken. Indigenous people had pre-literate languages, and that International Phonetic Alphabet is the invention of linguists who belong to the Aboriginal industry and rake off millions of dollars to develop this alphabet. This is not helpful to Indigenous people at all, and in fact deprives the marginalized members of the Indigenous community of the much needed services such as health, education, and housing. Thank you very much. I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Do we have questions or comments? Mayor Will. Widdowson.
Thank you for your presentation. Is there an opportunity that you might be acting Fall River as an opportunity to maybe couple with Kate Sutherland and have a community discussion?
Very much so. We had an event yesterday, and we actually had invited Evan Adams to sit with us, but he declined the invitation. And I was very, very happy to hear what Kate Sutherland had to say. And I actually was involved in work about this at Mount Royal University in what was called the Critical Thinking Series, where I invited 2 speakers to come with different points of view on a question. And we had what was called critical thinking facilitators who would try to summarize what each position was before we went to the question and answer period. And the person who we modeled our approach on was Peter Bogosian. And I would be happy to sit down with Evan Adams in such a format and try to figure out what our differences were with respect to truth and reconciliation.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions of council? I wish to thank you so much for coming forward, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much.